Okay, so you're all in doing what it takes to live longer and healthier, but you also have a really busy life. I totally get it. And sometimes when you hear the other podcasters out there, like sort of the extreme biohacker types, it sounds pretty daunting. And frankly, I think that kind of extreme messaging can make some people feel, well, like there's no possible way that they're going to do any of that. And so why even try? So they just give up. And that sucks because the truth is that you can do a lot to get healthier and live longer without being a complete maniac. Now, perhaps the most important pillar of longevity is exercise, but that's also the one that's really the hardest for people to follow through on because of work and time constraints. And well, some people just don't like exercise, right? So I've been thinking about what I call the 5 hour longevity workout week. In other words, if you could commit just 5 hours per week to exercise, how would those hours be optimized for the purpose of longevity and health span? Now, what was interesting and frankly reassuring to me was that the ideas that I have as a physician were virtually identical to the ideas that my friend Tom Walters had. Now, Tom is a doctor of physical therapy and professor of kinesiology. Simply put, he knows a lot more about exercise than me. But I do know a lot about medicine and I know a lot about the science of longevity. So we essentially were answering the same question from two different perspectives, but came up with the same answer. And I thought that was pretty cool. Now, I bet you're curious on what those 5 hours look like. And that's what we're going to talk about this week in this episode of Sapio with Buck Joffrey. Tom and I are going to reveal it and also touch on a number of other issues such as pain and placebo and even supplements. So make sure to tune in. And if you like what I'm doing, make sure to like, share, and subscribe.
In pursuit of health and wisdom, Sapio with Buck Joffrey.
Tom, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on. It's awesome.
So it's been, we've been talking offline a bunch about a lot of interesting topics, but I want to kind of get back to, some of the things that you and I both have in common, which are, an interest in people and health and that kind of thing. But we're coming at it from different perspectives, right? I mean, so your background, physical therapist. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background so we have an idea?
Yeah, so orthopedic physical therapy. Prior to that, I was really an athlete growing up, was in personal training while I was in college. So I kind of had this training exercise.
Yeah.
My degree in college was exercise science. So I was really into exercise physiology and exercise science. And then physical therapy, especially orthopedic physical therapy, is a pretty natural
Yeah.
continuation of that. You're just going from kind of studying kinesiology and regular human movement to studying pathokinesiology. And so, what happens when people have abnormal human movement, whether it's an injury or pain or some disease or condition. So, yeah, I kind of went down that road in orthopedic physical therapy, and it's just so kind of went from that training background to orthopedic physical therapy. And in physical therapy, there are different types.
Yeah.
So there are different, it's like the medical model
Yeah.
actually a lot now, where you have different board certifications. So you can go into neurological physical therapy, there's cardiovascular physical therapy, geriatric physical therapy, but orthopedics is kind of the one you would think of. It's the conditions most people have: low
Yeah.
back pain,
Yeah.
plantar fasciitis, tennis elbow. So you're really treating people who have had, maybe they've had surgery, had an injury that tore their ACL, something like that, or people who just have pain and they don't know where it's coming from. And those are actually those are the cases that I actually like the most as a physical therapist.
Yeah.
Just this, I've got pain, I didn't have an injury,
Yeah.
it just started, I don't know
Yeah.
why, and how can we go through and figure out what most likely is causing
Yeah.
that?
It's funny. It's kind of like the way you described it too.
Mm.
I was an athlete too.
Yeah.
I was an ice hockey player. I grew up in Minnesota.
Yeah.
And then I had my first back injury at 15 and anyway, derailed it, but I was a pretty serious ice hockey player for a bit. And then when I went to medical school, I totally hung out with, guess who? The orthopedic surgeons. Like those were my friends. Like all of the guys who were going into orthopedic surgery were my buddies. But the problem was, like, that's not the kind of surgeon I was.
Mm.
Like I was a soft tissue surgeon. I was like a micro, small kind of things. And I got really interested in neurosurgery and aneurysms and all these kinds of things like that.
Yeah.
But I used to hang out with the ortho guys and then ended up in neuro with all these geeks.
Wait, now do you go that direction because you're interested in that, or you were better at fine motor
I
skill?
think so academically, like I was definitely much more of a neuro guy, and I
Hmm.
was fine motor skills for sure.
Hmm.
I'm not like a hammer
Yeah,
nail kind of guy. I mean, I'm
yeah,
not a do-it-yourself
yeah,
guy at all. If me to clip an aneurysm, I can do it
yeah,
probably pretty well, but
yeah,
I'm not going to be sawing through anything
yeah,
soon.
yeah.
So, but yeah, it's funny how we get to our places. But and then we both kind of veered off, and we come back to
Hmm.
this. Space here of teaching too,
Hmm.
and one of the things that I've been doing as part of this whole thing is working on a little bit of a book. Okay, it's like a short handbook,
Hmm.
and that handbook, and we're going to talk about yours as well, but that short handbook is for people who I call it the living longer for people short on time.
Yeah,
Okay,
nice. I like it.
because I think one of the problems that we have in this society right now, and like this workout culture and longevity culture and everything like that, is it's like such an all or none thing, right? Like you're either going to be extreme guy, workout, biohacker,
Mhm.
whatever, or you're just like, I don't have time for that. I'm not going to do that. And you do nothing.
Mhm.
What's your experience on that? Do you feel like there's some truth to that?
Yeah, for sure. I
Yeah.
think, yeah, people are either, I think you do find a lot of people in those extremes who are either really sedentary and
Yeah.
not doing much, or, and I think people in that state perceive that there's a lot of friction, that to get to the other side, you have to be really extreme, and that
Right.
biohacker who's running ultra marathons and doing all this stuff. And I agree with you. I think sometimes what you need to do just to improve your health is
Yeah.
not that complicated, but it seems really complicated when you're online and you're listening to fitness and health influencers. It seems like
It sounds
it's
massively
intimidating.
overwhelming,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, it makes you just not want to do. It's like a screw it. I'm screwed. I don't have time for that. I don't want to
Hmm.
do that.
Yeah. And the truth is, like, I
Yeah.
think that's where education, because I think we're probably similar in that way, like just hearing about that book, I think education that's really successful is able to make things seem simple and digestible and break it down into
Yeah.
chunks. And that's a lot of I think that's a lot of the reason the stuff I've done over the years
Yeah.
online has resonated with people, because it's not overly complicated.
Yeah.
It's like there's a little bit of an academic piece, there's a little bit of, oh, here are a few physical therapy terms, but I can still understand this, and here's a few things I can start implementing, and it's not this huge monumental, you've got to go
Yeah.
work out 2 hours today. And
Uh-huh.
I think people just little tiny steps.
Well,
They
that's right. And so at the end so what one of the chapters in there,
Mm.
and this is where I was leading,
Yeah.
is called the 5 hour workout, like the 5 hour longevity workout week,
Mm-hmm.
right? And my attempt there, and I want to know what your version of
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
basically, was to say, okay, 5 hours per week. Most people can do 5 hours of exercise per week. If that's all you got,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
what do you do?
Yeah.
All right, so I want to hear what your take on this and why, and understanding that exercise for somebody who wants to train for a
Sure.
decathlon is completely different from someone who has the purpose of living
Mhm.
to, hopefully to 100 years
Mhm.
and still being able to be functional.
Mhm.
So if you brought it down to 5 hours,
Yep.
I know I'm putting you on the
Yeah,
spot
yeah.
because it's a lot of
It's a great
stuff, right?
question. It's a great
But
question.
how would you prioritize it?
Yeah, no, I think 5 hours is totally realistic. I mean, what I
Yeah,
do is probably around 5 hours.
yeah,
When you actually
yeah, me
boil it
too.
down, it's not like anything
Yeah.
crazy. And I think for the regular person who wants to get 99% of the health benefits, you don't really need more than that amount of
Mm-mm.
time for exercise. And to me, if you look at the research now on exercise science and longevity and the health side of it, I think it really boils down to cardiovascular aerobic exercise
Uh-huh.
and resistance training, strength training, and if I was looking at 5 hours, probably what I would tell people is, look at the American Council for Sports Medicine, right?
Yep.
They will talk about 30 minutes of exercise, basically 30 to 60 minutes on most days, and they're mostly in that category looking at aerobic exercise.
Sure.
So I think if you look at, there's a lot of people talking about this. There's a lot going on in the longevity space, and the thing that's one of the strongest predictors of how long you live is your VO2 max,
Right.
your aerobic capacity. So I think if it were me and I was thinking about that 5 hours, I would probably say you maybe you take that hour, or maybe it's 45 minutes. I would say, let's say you do 5 days. Let's go for
Hmm.
5 days. And I probably would take 30 minutes of that time and make it aerobic,
Okay, so you're at
so
like 2.5 hours.
yeah.
That's my number.
Yeah, is that what
That
you're,
was
yeah.
exactly what I put. 2.5 hours specifically of level 2.
Yep.
Level 2. We talk about VO2
Yep.
max just as a
Yep.
review. Basically, we don't have to get into it, but typically it's VO2 max is your maximum. You can define it. How about you define it for
Yeah, it's
us?
basically your body's sort of the maximum amount of oxygen that your body can use, that it can take out of the
Right.
air you're breathing and that your cells can uptake.
And then after that, you go into what's called a lactate threshold, which
Exactly.
is, you're not using oxygen
Hmm.
anymore and whatever. But it's split up, the different levels of are 1 through 5. Level 2 is about 60% VO2 max, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I think the easier way sometimes for people to know they're in level 2 is like if you're exercising, but you're a little winded, but you can still talk to somebody,
Yep.
that's level 2 exercise. And what we know from the data there is that's where it's at, right? Like level 2 exercise is like the thing that's going to, from a cardiovascular perspective, going to create the longest, the greatest ability for you to survive into the future with good cardiovascular fitness.
When we were talking about, I see you at the gym doing
That's exactly,
the incline treadmill is one of this workout gets talked a lot about, like
yeah,
putting the treadmill on an incline, walking for 30 minutes at a
yep,
certain certain speed.
yep,
It's one of and I think that zone 2 cardio is that's the one we hear a lot about. You want to try and get this on
yeah,
most days. And I think, just what you said, the easiest thing is, you're breathing to where you can still talk to someone
right,
else, but
right,
maybe there's a little bit of challenge there, but you can still talk. And
yeah,
so it doesn't even have to be that complicated. You could just be out going I mean, around here where we live, there's
exactly.
hills. You can just go for a walk.
Well, I mean, hiking, right? Like hiking for me covers a lot of these
Hmm.
different things that we're going to get
Yep.
to,
Yep.
right? But so that's
That's,
actually very cool. We hit 2.5 hours of
yes. They were the
level
same.
2
Yeah,
VO2
myself, totally.
max is literally what
Yep.
I have written down. Okay,
So
so
the other time, the rest of
uh-huh,
that time, I would say there's a ton of research to support resistance training.
yep,
So you need to maintain muscle mass as you age, right? There's this whole sarcopenia kind of concept where we lose
yep,
muscle mass naturally as we age. Strength training, when you're thinking about mortality and longevity as well, there are studies showing that losing strength is associated with mortality as well.
right.
And
Grip
grip
strength.
strength, yep, and
Yep,
quad strength. Those
yep,
are the two that are most
hmm,
tied to it. So I always tell people it's not that being weak with your grip or your quads necessarily means you're going to die sooner, but I think it's an indicator of sort of overall sort of weakness in the body. And there was a period of time in physical therapy where I worked in nursing homes, and you would see this with people, right? When they, especially quad strength, if you start to lose the muscles on the front of your thigh, your
yeah,
knee extensors, if your quads start to become weak, they're the muscles that straighten your knee. So if you go to get up from sitting or you're lowering yourself to sitting, your quads and your glutes are doing that. And so you would see in nursing homes, especially, that as people would lose quad strength, they couldn't transfer
yeah,
independently. So they couldn't get up from their chair and move to another one. They couldn't get up and walk. And that, just losing that ability and that functional independence because of a lack of strength, takes you down this sort of slope. You just start deteriorating. And so, but that's another thing. You don't have to be that complicated. If
exactly.
people
Yeah,
just added 20 to 30 minutes of strengthening. So if it were me, I'd probably split the time and say, I'm going to do 30 minutes of aerobic and then I'm going to do 30 minutes of strength training,
okay,
and do that 5 days a week.
got it.
And it doesn't have to be that complicated. When you look at strength training workouts, sometimes the bodybuilder splits are like the best. You don't have to do the really focused little muscle groups, but you go in and you say, I'm going to do a day at the gym where I'm going to do pushing exercises for my upper body. Like I'm going to do chest and tricep exercises.
Uh-huh,
So push-ups, bench press, incline bench press, dips, all these kind of big pushing muscle groups. And then you have a day where you do, say, like pulling muscle groups. So you do rows, lat pull down.
uh-huh,
You can do pull ups. You can do bent over rows with dumbbells. There's all these. You want to kind of focus on exercises that are compound in nature. So they're these multi joint.
hmm,
Because just going in and doing like tricep extensions,
yeah,
you wouldn't get the biggest bang for your buck with that,
yeah,
because you're focused on such a small muscle group. And if you're looking at, because a lot of people who are asking these questions don't really like exercising that much. They're not into the gym, and so you try to reduce the friction so that people can get in there. And I think if you have programs that move, but you have exercises that move multiple joints and work multiple muscle groups, you don't need as many exercises,
yeah,
right? And then you can have
yeah,
a leg day, like leg strengthening exercises. You can just do squats, lunges. Sometimes people like deadlifts, calf raises. There's just, you honestly, for the average human, could probably pick 10 to 15 exercises and just cycle those in your weekly workouts. Like pick 4 or 5 at a workout,
Hmm.
whatever it takes you in your 30 minutes, 3 to 5 exercises probably, 3 sets of 10 to 15 of each one. And you really are going to get, again, that 99% of the benefits that are associated with resistance training. It doesn't have to be this really complicated muscle confusion. I mix it up every workout. Just pick 10 to 15 exercises and rotate through them.
So let me ask you this. So one of the confusing things like throughout my life of,
Hmm.
being in the gym and lifting as a kid and when I'm older, and obviously it's different for what you're trying to achieve,
Sure.
but for the purpose of longevity, and when you lift, um, how do you base like how much to lift in
Hmm.
terms of like the percentage of your maximum weight, and then how many repetitions, how many sets? Is there data on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of different charts, and right, like when you're younger, a lot of people, when you're in sports, you'll test your 1 rep
Yeah.
max and really base it off of that. If you look at the interesting thing about longevity and resistance training is that we used to be really specific. There's a whole the National Strength and Conditioning Association. They have this whole textbook that's on strength and conditioning research. And we used to be really specific with you've got to do this number of sets and this number of reps if you want to focus on strength,
Right.
or if you want to focus on hypertrophy or muscle endurance. And that research has kind of changed and it's gotten simpler, which is nice. So it's gotten to the point now where it's like if you just get a weight that's challenging and go until you're fatigued, you will get
Yeah.
stronger. Like your
So
muscle,
higher reps in general,
well, it's
like
there's still
15,
research supporting low reps for strength. That's traditionally the strengthening kind of rep range is 1 to 6.
Uh-huh.
So it'd be 1 to 6 reps, and they would say around 85% of your 1 rep max.
Okay.
But I think that's great if you're like in your teens and
Yeah,
20s.
yeah,
But I
yeah.
think, as you get older, your body doesn't respond super well sometimes to that. Like it lengthens your recovery, you're sore for longer, you're more likely to get injured. I
Yeah.
think that for people, once you start to get past the age of really probably 35, 40, you start looking at maybe not these really heavy loads where I'm getting fatigued in 1 to 6 reps, but I'm going to lighten the weight a little bit and get tired more in the 10 to 15 repetition
Yeah.
range. And I think that's the easier thing to me is that I tell people, if you have a spotter, that's amazing because then
Mhm.
you can really go to fatigue. If you don't have a spotter, then I usually tell people try to go to the point where the last rep or two is difficult, but you can still get it back safely. If you're bench pressing, you can still get it back. You can
Yeah.
hook the bar and not drop, you're not risking your safety. But thinking about it more just from are the last couple reps difficult? And if they aren't, then I need to bump the weight up a little
Yeah.
bit.
What's your take on the whole high intensity thing, the hit workout?
Yeah, I think there's evidence to support that, especially when you're thinking about that aerobic kind of capacity and
Hmm.
VO2 max. I see more and more people talking about, okay, focus on the zone two, get that on most days,
Yeah.
but then maybe you have 1 day a week where you do something 1 to 2 days a week that's a high
Yeah.
intensity kind of interval. Maybe it's running sprints. I think sometimes that
Yeah.
could be an easy one is just you go to a local track
Yeah.
and you run a sprint and then walk a little bit and something
Yeah.
like that.
That's evidence on that is pretty interesting, and I think the idea with it really is like trying to essentially challenge the mitochondria, right? Like
Hmm.
these little workhorses in the cell,
Yep.
and you want to try to like get turnover of those mitochondria, get new ones,
Hmm.
that kind of thing. So, I kind of like the idea of taking a 30-minute VO2 level 2 VO2 max and then
Hmm.
tacking on a few minutes of hit at the
Hmm.
end of it every day, even
Yeah.
if that's like 5 or 6 extra minutes. I don't necessarily do that because I just get busy or whatever,
Yeah.
but I think like that's kind of a easy way to do it.
I kind of like that actually. I went and ran down at the beach this morning, and at the end, so I usually would just do like 3 miles.
Yeah.
I'm not actually really into long distance running.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
a sprinter in high school, and so, but I know that there's all this research supporting,
Yeah.
VO2 max and zone two. So I'll do kind of just a light run, but then today, like at the end, I walked for a little while, and then I did some more explosive, kind of almost drills I would have done back in my track and field days, and it
Uh-huh.
got my heart rate up a little bit more, and it it kind of just by accident, I think I did a little bit of what you're talking about,
Yeah.
and I kind of liked it rather than having a dedicated day that's just sprint training and high intensity interval, just to put it at the end of your zone two when you're already warmed up.
Sort of makes sense, right? Like, and
Mm-hmm.
then you're kind of, doing essentially what you're trying to do, which is to like optimize your cardiovascular fitness,
Mm-hmm.
and do it all at the same time.
Yeah.
But
You know, the interesting thing about that stuff too is that in the musculoskeletal world and more my world, we do want to practice those things, sometimes those kind of more explosive, power-based exercises,
yeah,
because they are where we tend to see people get injured a
injuries.
lot when
Yeah.
they get older. You know, it's like you're like the dad who pulls your
Weekend
hamstring.
warrior.
Totally. Like, and you lose that capacity, right?
Right,
Like
right.
anything you don't keep training,
Yeah.
you're losing that capacity naturally as you age. So
Yeah.
if you don't train it, you're just going to lose it even more. And I've had a couple of these things. I mean, I used to think I was totally immune to hamstring strains with like sprinting and running, and I got
Yeah.
one a few years back, and I was like, wow. And I realized I hadn't been training this like I had when I was younger, and so I have been trying to incorporate more of that kind of exercise in the physical therapy world. We look at, there's a lot of people with tendinopathy where they have tendon pains, like they've got a rotator cuff tendon pain, or they've got tennis elbow, or they've got like the front of their knee, their patellar tendon, their Achilles tendon. There's a lot of tendinopathies, and tendinopathies, tendons will often get irritated when you do something that's more explosive that you haven't done in a while, or you do way more of it than you're used to. So you hear of a
Yeah.
lot of runners, like running is a very, we take it for granted, but it's a very explosive activity on the Achilles tendon. And if you
Sure.
don't train running often, your Achilles tendon can develop tendinopathy and get this kind of Achilles tendonitis. And so one of the ways to help protect your musculoskeletal system is to have explosive drills kind of built in. And so not only would you get that high intensity cardiovascular exercise, but mixing in things like jumping and sprinting actually helps keep your tendons healthy, your muscles healthy, and it's associated with increases in bone density. So there's all these kind of other, I think these other benefits that come along with doing some kind of explosive training a
Yeah.
little bit in your week.
So the other component that I added, which, just again based on this idea of trying to maintain functionality, and when you're 100 years old, as I think a lot of people will end up being, uh, is the mobility, flexibility, balance kind of stuff, right? So I guess the question is, for me, the way I do get that is, I hike. So I'm
Mm,
doing, and as for people who don't know where we live in these areas with these beautiful mountains that are pretty steep, right?
mm,
So you can get quite a bit of exercise. You're dodging
yep.
rocks and all that kind of thing, and you're trying to maintain your balance and gravel. So for me, a lot of that, certainly balance and mobility, I think is covered by that.
Mm,
And I do like a stretch kind of class for
mhm.
dynamic stretching. But like, I think what would you, I mean, how important do you think those things are, and how would you address those?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, balance, balance for sure. Like balance, especially as people age, is obviously huge. We
Yeah,
hear about how detrimental falls are in the
sure.
elderly population and how many people die after things like hip fractures, which often come from falls. So if you're looking at fall risk, there's a lot of research out there supporting just kind of balance training, especially if you notice you have some kind of balance impairment, which could
Uh-huh.
be like simple things like just standing on one leg. And, we do this test in physical therapy called the Berg Balance Scale. And it's basically an inventory and take people through these little mini tasks, and it gives them a score at the end. And basically, that score correlates to your fall risk. But the hardest things in that are single leg, standing and balancing on one leg, and then one called tandem stance where you basically stand heel to toe, in a straight line. And for anyone who has decent balance, those are going to seem really easy. You only have to be able to do them for 3 seconds on that
Yeah,
test. But a lot of older people with balance issues cannot hold those for 3 seconds.
yeah.
So, if you notice that you have a balance impairment, I think there's a lot you can train that system a
Well,
lot with exercise.
let's
Yeah,
take it a step back though,
sure.
because now if we're talking, so, and this is an interesting like set of things that I'm talking about
Yeah,
now, because I think when you're young and healthy, you don't really,
think about
you
it.
don't think about
Yeah.
it, right? And so the concept here is like, okay, well, maybe I should be thinking about it because these are some of the things that happen when you get old.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you want to continue to stay mobile, functional, be able to move around and not fall, like what are some simple things we could do just today that might help to maintain what we've got?
Yeah, I think we know when it comes to those things, it could be just incorporating some simple kind of balance exercises here and there into your workouts. It could be, honestly, probably the one that's the most helpful for the most people is just balancing on one leg, just standing on one leg
Yeah.
and seeing can you balance for 30 to 60 seconds.
Yeah.
And then you can try it. Most of us rely on our visual system for balance, a
Yep.
huge percentage of it. So
Mhm.
sometimes you can do those things with your eyes closed if it's really easy for you to just stand. You can do uneven surfaces where you were just talking about hiking, right?
Yeah.
You're hiking is great because, like you said, you're encountering these uneven surfaces all the
Right.
time, and the trails here are very technical, so it's nice. But if you don't have that, you could just go out and stand in a patch of grass. You could stand in sand.
Sure.
Just
People
make,
wondering what you're doing, but
yeah, you look kind of crazy.
but then, 50 years from now, you'll be the one
Yeah,
laughing
exactly,
about that,
exactly.
right?
No, I think there's, balance. So I think if you're looking at the research on longevity and health, the things you're going to prioritize are aerobic exercise and strength training.
Yep.
Below that is going to be balance, mobility, flexibility. Mobility and flexibility, that kind of idea of like how flexible am I? Like how much can I stretch in these positions? Can I like do a sit and reach test and can I touch my toes or whatever? Like all these different flexibility tests. Do your joints move to their full range of motion? Most people who are relatively healthy, that is not as big an issue for them. And even if you look at, there's been injury prevention kind of studies on these different types of exercise. So like if you compare strength training to balance and flexibility work to balance work, the thing that has the best evidence for preventing injuries is strength training.
Is that right?
It has the best evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So that, which I think makes sense if you're thinking about your musculoskeletal system, because even though it's not a machine like a car, it has machine characteristics. And if you look at, say, like your muscle tendon unit, you look at your bones, you look at your ligaments, they are very mechanical. They have very biomechanical qualities. And
Sure.
if you, strength training naturally improves the integrity of those.
Yeah.
So if the integrity of your soft tissues is higher, if the capacity is higher, you're less likely to tear things,
Makes sense.
less likely to have fractures, things like that. So strength training has the best evidence for injury prevention, but we put things like mobility and flexibility a little lower because most people have the range of motion they need to carry out their activities of daily living. But if you have a mobility limitation, then that is definitely important to address.
Sure.
Like if you look at one of the tests that's very simple that people can try, that we look out in physical therapy that's scored on 11-point scales. You start in standing. You try to get down to sitting on the ground without using your hands or touching your knees or anything. Can you get to the ground and then back up? If you can do that without touching, losing your balance, touching your knees or other parts of your legs, you get the full 11 points. Each thing you touch or lose your balance, you lose a point. And this has been shown also to be associated with mortality. They studied this in people and then tracked them. The people with the lower scores died sooner.
Oh, is that right?
And it's basically a mobility and a
So you're
strength
talking about
test.
like sort of standing and then kind
All
of
the way down,
squatting
all the way down to like legs crossed on the
to,
ground.
to legs crossed without
Yep.
using your hands.
Yes.
I don't know if I could do that
It's
now.
hard. It's hard.
Yeah.
Like it's really hard. So if you touch with one
Yeah.
hand, most people probably could do it if they can touch with one
Yeah. Yeah.
hand or
Yeah.
go to a
Yeah.
knee. You just lose a point for that. So
Right.
then you're 10 and 11.
Okay.
So or maybe you have to do it both directions. So you're at,
Yeah.
you're at 9 and 11. So but it's something to practice and it's pretty easy. And I like that test because it has, of course, a strength component to it. You have to have good quad and glute strength to get up and down off the ground. But it also requires a ton of mobility. You've got to have good knee flexion. You got to be able to bend your knees through 4-inch motion. You've got to bend your hips decently. Your low back's got to flex. So it's a good test in that it looks at what is your strength and mobility like? Because that's going to how it happens in life, right? Like you got
Right.
those two things together. And it's just a good simple test to look at your score. How
Yeah.
close are you to 11 points? And you can kind of use that. If you can't do it, then it's something to work on. And
Yeah.
even just that test can be an exercise. A lot of times we won't discharge people from physical therapy in nursing home settings until they can get up and down off the ground.
All right, let's shift topics a
Mm.
little bit. Something that especially I dealt with specifically like in neurosurgery, back injuries, things like that. And you see every day, probably the primary reason for people seeing somebody like you is pain. So it's a complex topic,
Oh my gosh.
right?
Yeah.
So I want to kind of let's start with from the top. Like when you hear somebody start talking about pain, what kinds of ideas are flying through your head?
Yeah, it's so complex. I mean, we've learned so much. This is probably my main area of interest is kind of pain neuroscience, and
Hmm.
it has changed so much. I mean, I graduated from physical therapy school in 2007, and the way we think about pain is so different from back
Is that
then. I
right?
mean, it was very Pain from a physical therapy standpoint in those days was very, we would call it the postural structural biomechanical model. So it was all about, like, most people will think of this when they go to physical therapy. It's like, oh, how's my posture? How's my mobility? It was very, what's my strength like? It was very posture, like, what's my anatomy? Is one leg longer than the other?
Right.
That's kind of all those things. And that was how I operated for quite a few years as a PT. But what we found is just as the pain neuroscience research went on, you really found out that pain is way more complex. It's
Yeah.
not just the problem with that is that we thought about the body as this like your car. Like you're something's broken in your car, you just go get it fixed and
Yeah.
it's better. But you'd have people get things fixed in orthopedic surgery and not be better, right? They'd still have pain in some
Mm-hmm.
cases. So or they do these studies where they do fake surgeries on people and their
Sham.
pain would get better.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. You have a sham surgery, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
see these in meniscus surgeries, tennis elbow, they'll do these sham
Yeah.
operations and people would have similar reductions in pain to the people who had the actual
Right.
surgery.
Right.
So,
Well, no, what's interesting about that, Tom, is
yeah.
like, and I'm sure you're going to get to this, is that I am fascinated by that idea.
Mm,
Not because, okay, so traditionally in medicine, we would take sham surgery, and if there was no difference between placebo, which
mhm,
is the sham,
mhm,
and the intervention, then we would conclude that the intervention just was no good,
mm,
and neither was good. But really it was revealing is that there's something else that's good, and it's actually up
mm.
in here, and it's more psychological,
For
right?
sure.
So,
And I think, to your
right.
original question, I think when somebody tells me they're in pain now, what happens is there's this
Mm,
whole other cascade of things that I think about, all these other factors.
yeah.
Like, what are the factors involved in this person's particular pain experience? Pain is talked about now as this emergent property, this kind of emergent experience that your brain produces.
Mhm,
And that has changed a lot too. We used to think that you'd get hurt somewhere, like you hurt your knee, and the pain receptors there would detect pain, and they'd send that to your brain and tell you you're in pain. And that's this really old Cartesian model that
mhm,
a lot of medicine and physical therapy, still a lot of people still kind of follow that. But really, the more current research has shown that you can have, say you injure yourself, say you sprain your ankle or something, you will have messages that come from these nociceptors, which are danger
mhm.
receptors in the tissue. They're free nerve endings that detect noxious stimuli, dangerous stimuli. So they will send a message to your brain, and your brain will look at everything going on, memories, visual input, where are you at in the environment, memory, have I been here before? How stressed am I? How well did I sleep last night? What's nutritionally, what's going on? There's all these factors that are influencing your brain and nervous system. And then your brain is going to decide ultimately, should I produce pain? Because pain is ultimately at the end of the day a survival, it's a
Mhm.
survival experience. It's meant to protect you.
Right.
So is it valuable to produce pain right now to protect this person? And of course, we know that there are maladaptive pain states where that system can become hypersensitive and and really not the pain experience is not a good reflection of what's happening in the body. It's not a good indicator of tissue health or what's happening. We see this with these chronic pain states like fibromyalgia
Yep.
and chronic regional pain syndrome and things where people are having horrible pain, but you could do all kinds of imaging on their body and find nothing.
Yeah.
So I think, I just now think it's a very complex experience. And when somebody's coming in talking to me, I'm going to try to get to the root of what's the unique combination of factors in their life that's associated with their pain experience.
Yeah. In terms of, I mean, it ultimately is sort of like the placebo effect and then sort of the anti-placebo effect, right? So we know from, and what I was getting at with this idea that with sham surgery and all these kinds of things, that there seems to be some benefit just from thinking you're treated. I think, the first study on this was, I think, in 1799, and there was basically some guy who was like in the U.S. who was trying to sell these rods. You know this
I don't know
story?
this study.
This
Yeah.
is this is his first study,
Yeah.
documented study
Yeah.
of placebo effect.
Yeah.
But
A magic rod.
yeah, yeah, this is like a magic rod that he claimed, it was the Americans, right, back then, that had certain electromagnetic properties that would, if you touch somebody with it in an area of arthritis, it would take away their inflammation. So it was selling like crazy. But this English physician says, there's no way that's true. I'm going to test this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to give these patients this, and then I'm going to give half the patients ones that are just made of wood. They won't know the difference. And what he concluded was, yeah, it works, but it works in both categories. So it's not the rod. So he blamed that on imagination and basically kind of threw it out. But what we know now is like we have functional MRI studies that show that when patients believe their pain is being treated, there's actual release of various things in the brain, including opioids,
Totally.
right? So it's a physiological thing. We think of placebo as imagination, but it's actually a physiological phenomena. And it's the opposite of what you're talking about, because if your body can produce opioids into response of thinking it's being treated, on the opposite end of that spectrum is various chemicals being released with the anticipation of pain and the expectation of pain, right? I mean, and that's kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah, there's both. Yeah, there's both sides, and most people have heard of placebo and are more familiar with that.
Right,
And yeah, the nocebo is on that opposite
right,
side, where essentially a harmful belief can cause symptoms.
right.
You can they have studies where they'll take people and they'll use virtual reality and things and make it look like they're gonna like cut their arm with a knife or something, and the person will produce pain, will feel pain there, report pain, even though they're not really touching
Yeah,
them or doing
yeah,
anything. So just with visual input, there's a kind of a cool study where they take people and another metal rod, they'll touch them on the back of the hand, and they don't tell the person anything about the metal rod, the temperature, anything like that. They just show them either a red or a blue light. And sometimes they let people look at it, touch their hands. Sometimes they don't let them touch it. And the people who report the worst pain are when they see a red light first and they see it touch their hand. They report
yeah,
the most.
yeah.
Whereas if you see a blue light, it's like, oh, it's going to be a cold rod. There's a lot of meaning in what we feel. And so it is really interesting that you have these placebo and kind of nocebo mechanisms. And I think what you're talking about, so many medical interventions and rehab interventions are thought to be attributed to your beliefs in placebo. And there would have been a time when I was a new practitioner that if somebody came in and said, "Oh, the ultrasound is really helping me," I would have said, "There's no research to support ultrasound." And
Right.
I think looking back on it, I don't do that as much anymore, because even if somebody comes in and tells me that a particular intervention helped them, and I know there's a bunch of research showing that that is probably mostly a placebo-based intervention, I'm not as quick to take that away from people, because like you said, there's functional MRI studies showing that when you believe something's going to help you, it can actually change
Yeah,
your brain. You can release those endogenous opioids.
yeah.
I mean, it's
And what's fascinating to me is that I mean, why would we think that those neurotransmitters that are being released are limited to pain,
mhm,
right? I mean, if we're talking about, uh, not feeling pain, there's other mechanisms in there too. Is there something that inherently the brain can do to reduce its own level of inflammation?
mhm,
Is there mechanisms or chemicals being released that are accelerating the healing process?
mhm.
So, the bottom line is, I guess, like that to me is a very fascinating thing. And then even beyond like the world of pain, it just is like a metaphor for everyday life. I
Totally,
mean,
totally.
like what you believe,
Oh yeah,
right?
no, it's so true.
Yeah,
And I think what you were talking about, I wouldn't be surprised if there's all kinds of other things happening, because they talk about our nervous system, immune systems really being kind of one system.
yep,
It's like this a neuroimmune system, and they're so tied together. And I think if you believe something's going to help you, or you have some hope, that I think is going to have this whole cascade of positive effects, not just pain, but throughout your
hmm,
body, on the healing response, on inflammation. I think when we look at interventions for pain, I do think in the pain kind of science world, there is a lot of value placed on sham studies, because
sure,
you do still, at the end of the day, I think, want to find what are the things with the best efficacy for
sure,
actually treating pain. But I do think exactly what you were saying before. We used to hear about placebo and just like, ugh, placebo, throw it out. This isn't something we should look at. But now I think the medical community, that research community, is coming around more and understanding how powerful these placebo, they call them non-specific brain effects, like how powerful that stuff can be. And if part of what you're doing brings some of those placebo mechanisms in, then that's just going to be help the person maybe that much
yeah. I mean,
more. So,
there's placebo effects for neurodegenerative disease.
hmm, hmm,
I mean, That's
amazing.
very powerful
Totally.
physiological stuff, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, I mean, obviously, underlying a lot of this, there really is some physiological injury as well. So that's not to discount that, but I think our both of our points is it's a very comprehensive thing. I think even culturally, I think there's some differences. I'm sure if you've done some research on this, I mean, in terms of like the way pain
Mm.
in general is perceived from one culture to another and what that experience is all about.
Yeah, there are some really interesting ones out there. This kind of goes back to this. They'll talk a lot about in pain science that the pain we experience, a lot of it has to do with what something means to us. And if
Hmm.
something, the meaning of it is less threatening, then we usually will have less pain. And so there are kind of interesting cultural ones where you look at like fire walking in cultures who that's a regular practice in their culture. They don't perceive it as some really dangerous, threatening thing, so they don't report that much pain with it.
Right.
Whereas if we went and did it, it'd be scary to us and we'd probably have a lot of pain.
Yeah.
There's a really interesting one that gets talked about in the Philippines. They do voluntary crucifixions at Easter,
Oh,
and there
wow.
were people that were literally crucify themselves for like 5 to 10 minutes, and same nails in the hands and everything. They don't report, I mean, it's uncomfortable, but they don't report serious pain from it. But I
Really?
think because it
Huh.
carries this heavy cultural significance, and so
Yeah.
even pain reports, culturally are very different. In some cultures, pain is viewed as a weakness, right? And they're not going to talk about it a whole lot.
Sure.
So that part, it goes back to there's all these factors that go along with pain. And things that I think when people have physical pain in their body, like say someone has low back pain, most people are going to think, oh, I hurt a disc in my back or something, right? They're going to think I have a disc bulge or I strained a muscle in my back. And that could be, but it could also be tied to other factors that you might not associate with your musculoskeletal system, like how much are you sleeping?
Hmm.
What's your nutrition like? Do you have a really pro-inflammatory diet? How stressed are you? I mean, a lot of these a lot of people will start with an acute pain. Like maybe they actually had an injury or they strained something at first. But what we'll see is that you're more likely to have that last and turn into chronic pain if you have these other factors like a lot of stress, poor sleep, poor nutrition, you don't exercise very much. So I think that's where, I'm always, pain has just become such a more complex thing. And even when patients come in and talk to me, a lot of the sessions I spend with people are listening to their story.
Hmm.
Sometimes my first evaluation of people can be 2 hours because I'm
Yeah.
just trying to get that whole story out because you don't, and never do you get all of it in the first visit. But as you spend more time with people, you start to peel back the layers on things that maybe could be associated with their pain. And I think a lot of times people are resistant to hearing about some of these other factors. They want to just blame it on something in their physical body. And
Yeah.
a lot of it is kind of planting seeds and getting people to understand how complex pain really is.
Right. Hey, we're going to stop right here and let you get on with your day. Tom and I will be back with you in the next episode to finish our conversation. For Sapio with Buck Joffrey, I'm Buck Joffrey. If you like what I'm doing, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for listening to Sapio with Buck Joffrey. A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make.